If money is the memory of exchanges, who holds the power to write into that memory? We live in a strange era where you can send a photo across the world in an instant, yet it takes banks 3 days to confirm a domestic transaction. An era where every number in your account seems solid, only to evaporate due to an interest rate decision announced at midnight. Where you work diligently, but the value you create is determined by people you've never met, in meetings you were never invited to. So, what truly lies behind the mask of the modern financial system? Is it a neutral tool serving economic progress, or a political mechanism skillfully disguised by technocratic terms? Broken money doesn't begin with a declaration, but with a profound suspicion that what we call money, the foundation of all social interaction, is fundamentally flawed. Not flawed due to technical error, but because it serves a power order, not humanity. Let's dive into the summary of this book. Part 1. What is money? No one taught me what money was when I was a child. They just gave me some loose coins, called them a reward, and told me to hold on tight. Money was something vague, both desirable and incomprehensible, a solution and the root of countless unnamed troubles. But the deeper I delved, the more I realized that money didn't start with glittering metal coins or papers printed with presidents' faces. It began with memory, a promise, a faint scratch on a cave wall recording who helped whom, who owed what to whom. Before money appeared, humanity relied on invisible ledgers, records kept by memory and trust. You help me pick fruit, I promise to repay you with hunted meat. No paperwork, no witnesses, just trust and the repetition of small transactions creating a chain of debt. Repay, help, compensate. The ledger wasn't a bank's invention, it was an instinct for survival. But then came a day when trust wasn't enough. Society expanded, strangers outnumbered acquaintances. When you don't know if the person opposite you will keep their word, you can't rely solely on memory or kindness. You need something more concrete, something you can hold in your hand, wear around your neck, pass down through generations. And so, seashells, bird feathers, cacao beans, and polished stones appeared. All these things were, in essence, just forms of the same principle, materializing trust with a physical object. But not all materials were worthy of being money. To become money, it had to be rare, durable, difficult to counterfeit, and easy to verify. Seashells possessed these qualities. To create a complete string of shells, people had to dig, polish, drill holes, and string them together. A process arduous enough to convince the recipient that the giver had invested time and effort. This object truly had value, it was money. From its very beginning, money wasn't just a medium of exchange, it was proof of labor, a physical trace of a trustworthy effort. In many ancient tribes, there were no prisons, no police, no court systems. So how did they control behavior? The answer lay in the social ledger, what we call reputation. Whoever didn't keep their word, whoever didn't repay a kindness, would be isolated. The ledger became a weapon of trust, and money was merely a physical replica of that weapon. Money wasn't an invention of governments. It was a byproduct of social networks. When a community grew large enough, transactions became complex enough, money appeared as a solution to ambiguity. And every time money changed form from seashells to gold, from gold to paper, from paper to digital data, it wasn't just a material revolution, but a restructuring of social trust itself. What haunted me wasn't that seashells were once used as money. That's widely known. What kept me awake for many nights was when I understood that every form of money is a simulation of a ledger. And when the person controlling the ledger is a small group, while everyone else only gets to see a photocopy, that's no longer trust, it's dependence. When small tribes used seashells for exchange, they accepted that nature was a fair gatekeeper. Seashells couldn't be arbitrarily produced. But when technology emerged, a coastal tribe invented a way to mass-produce seashells, flooding the market, breaking the old order. They literally printed more money and exchanged it for land, food, power. When others discovered the shells had lost value, it wasn't because their shape changed, but because the ledger had been manipulated. At that moment, money began to lose its sacredness. It was no longer proof of effort, but became a weapon of control. No one knew exactly who held the ledger, who changed the figures, who added lines of debt without real transactions. And that's when monetary history entered an era of distrust. I once thought money was neutral. Now I understand money always takes sides. It's not just a medium, It's an expression of who is empowered to write into the ledger. And if you don't hold the pen, your name in it is just a number, without a voice. Gold wasn't a random choice. It wasn't just shiny, beautiful, or rare. Gold is a material that nature bestowed upon us with a terrifying paradox, incredibly durable yet not easily found. You can't eat gold. It won't keep you warmer when it's cold or feed you when you're hungry. But it has an instinctive allure, a material that cannot be faked, cannot be counterfeited, and is almost impervious to time. If there is a purest definition of money, gold is the first physical embodiment of that concept. Trading with gold was an upgrade of the ledger from memory to a physical object, and now to an object that can be objectively divided, measured, and authenticated. It no longer depended on community memory. A gold nugget weighing exactly 10 grams is 10 grams everywhere. The ledger had become global. Even though no one used computers, yet humans, by instinct, are never satisfied with what they have. They didn't want to carry bags of gold to the market. They wanted something more convenient, faster, and in some ways more flexible. That's when paper money appeared. Initially, paper money was just a promise. You gave me gold. I gave you a piece of paper stating you had the right to exchange it for gold when needed. The paper had no intrinsic value, but it represented something of value. It was an IOU, a voucher for trust. And so we returned to a ledger. But this time, it was a centralized ledger. Who held the paper? The bank. Who guaranteed you would get your gold back? The bank. And from that moment, trust was no longer distributed across the community but concentrated at a single point, an institution with the power to issue ledgers on your behalf. The problem was, and always is, would that institution keep its word? Was anyone overseeing them? And if one day they issued more paper than the gold they had, would you know? Could you do anything? The truth is, they did. And when paper began to exceed gold reserves, money once again lost its original fairness. But you didn't realize, no one realized. Because paper money still circulated, transactions still occurred, everything looked normal. It was only when too many people demanded gold at once that the system collapsed. Bank runs, credit crises, bank failures all were signs that the ledger had been manipulated excessively. The irony is that when gold was money, you held the power. But when gold was replaced by paper money and paper money by electronic data, you no longer held anything at all, only numbers in a system where you don't know who is typing on the keyboard. I used to look at a coin and think, this is money. Now I look at it and see a veil. It conceals a history of intermediation, of invisible power shifts from community to organization, from individual to institution, from trust to control. Because every form of money requires a ledger to operate. And if you don't know where the ledger is, who holds it, who writes it, who edits it, then you are playing a game of chess where the pawn never wins. The evolution from seashells to gold, from gold to paper, from paper to digital data is not just a technological story. It's a history of trust being professionalized, packaged, and resold to you at a higher price than you imagined. That's why understanding money isn't just about understanding economics. Understanding money is understanding power. Understanding money is knowing that what you see isn't always the truth, and that the current ledger system might be beautiful and smooth, but it's designed so you don't see whose hand is holding the pen. We've come a long way from simple promises between two children to minted metal coins, then to numbers scrolling across electronic banking screens. But each step has a common thread. Creating money means creating a ledger, and the one who creates money is the one allowed to write into that ledger. So what exactly is money? Not everyone agrees. Some say money is a medium of exchange. Others say it's a store of value or a unit of account. But all these definitions are merely surface manifestations. When you strip away the layers, you'll find at the core of every monetary system a single thing: the ability to remember and affirm who owes what to whom. Money is how society records contributions, expects repayment, and the mechanism to make that happen without personal trust. A unified theory of money lies not in the object you hold, but in the mechanism that controls the ledger behind it. From this, we can classify monetary systems into three main forms. 1. Decentralized ledger. This is when the community collectively remembers, collectively monitors, and fraud is punished by loss of trust. Tribal systems, honor-based transactions, and even early social networks are examples. The risks here are forgetfulness, bias, and limited scale. 2. Centralized ledger. Asterisk, this is when an organization records, guarantees, and coordinates transactions. Banks, governments, credit unions all fall into this category. It has the advantages of speed and efficiency, but the disadvantages are the risk of abuse of power and lack of transparency. 3. Technology-based distributed ledger. Asterisk, where everyone has a copy, no one has the unilateral right to edit, and all changes must be agreed upon by consensus. This is the logic behind blockchain technology, of which Bitcoin is the first and clearest representative. It tries to reclaim the primitive transparency of gold, but with the speed and flexibility of digital data. The interesting thing is that these three forms of ledgers are not mutually exclusive. They often intertwine. A person might use a community ledger for daily transactions, a centralized ledger for their salary, and a distributed ledger for savings. But the existence of multiple types of ledgers doesn't balance them. It raises the question, who do we want to place our trust in? Therefore, understanding money is no longer a game of numbers, but a journey to trace the origins of power. Who is allowed to add zeros to an account? Who decides if you can exchange paper for gold? Who has the power to block, delete, or reverse a transaction? Each of these questions, if answered, will tell you what kind of ledger you are living in and by whom you are controlled. The truth is not easy to accept. Most of us are too accustomed to accepting ledgers written by others. We call it faith in the system, economic stability, wise monetary policy. But behind those beautiful words are countless silent adjustments, instances of money printing without consultation, crises arising from lines of numbers no one truly understands. And the tragedy is that we only realize the ledger has been abused when it collapses. If you don't know who holds the pen, you will merely be a number waiting for someone else to write your story. But if you see the true nature of money a ledger with an owner, then you have a chance to reclaim the pen for yourself. Money, ultimately, is not what you spend. It's what reveals which belief system you live in. And sometimes, how you use money is a declaration of who you want to control your future. Part 2, the birth of banking. There was a moment in history when people decided, no more burying gold in the ground. They brought it to places with guards, thick walls, iron doors, where thieves couldn't reach. But when depositing gold, they didn't just want it safeguarded, they wanted something more, a promise, a ticket to exchange for gold when needed. And when these tickets began to be traded like gold itself, the bank as we know it today was born. But even before banks, before cold safes, there were more rudimentary versions that few paid attention to. In the ancient Middle East, merchants once used hawala, a money transfer system based entirely on honor and promise. No cash needed, no bank needed, just two brokers, one at the origin, one at the destination end, a bond between them stronger than any legal document: reputation. Imagine someone in India wanting to send money to a relative in Cairo. They find a local hawala agent, hand over the money, and receive a code. This hawala agent contacts their colleague in Cairo, also a hawala agent, and transfers the code. The relative in Cairo simply needs to provide the correct code to receive the full amount, no paperwork, no wire transfer, no trace, just a verbal ledger and the bond of honor between the hawala agents. If you think that sounds too risky, imagine a society where honor is more important than profit. A hawala agent caught cheating would be expelled from the network, losing credibility. No one would transact with them again. That was the first decentralized form of banking, where the ledger was protected not by encryption, but by social consequences. But then Europe entered a period of commercial boom, with transactions crossing oceans. Goods traveled worldwide, and honor was no longer fast enough to keep pace with merchant ships. Merchants needed a more precise ledger system, easier to reconcile, and especially one that could record debts, interest, and risks in a clear, verifiable way. That's when debentry bookkeeping was born. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Every transaction has two sides, a debit and a credit, and must balance. Every sum of money you receive is accompanied by a sum someone else loses. Every time you spend, there's a record that your assets decrease. The ledger was no longer a simple list, but a logical system reflecting the flow of money like a machine. With debentry accounting, merchants could track every penny of profit and loss, check if the other party was cheating, and most importantly, trace responsibility if things went wrong. Double-entry accounting became the foundation of modern banking and also the starting point for the endless battle to control the ledger. Because if someone controls the ledger, they control history, and if they have the power to write history, they can rearrange the truth. When the first banks emerged, they didn't just hold gold, they held the ledger. And then they realized something strange: very few people actually came to withdraw gold. Most only needed a confirmation slip. So why not issue more slips than the actual amount of gold? That simple question was the seed for every banking crisis thereafter. It unveiled a paradoxical reality. Banks could create money out of thin air as long as enough people believed in their slips. And so, banks didn't just hold money. They created money no mining needed, no craftsmanship, just a signature, a ledger, and social trust. When banks discovered they could create money by issuing more slips than the actual gold they held, something changed forever in the power structure of society. From a neutral custodian, the bank began to transform into a player in the monetary game, where they both commanded the pieces and kept score. People called it fractional reserve banking. It sounds specialized, but in reality, it simply means that banks keep a small fraction of real money and lend out the rest with paper promises. This was incredibly effective because, under normal conditions, depositors never withdrew everything at once. Only when confidence collapsed, like a rumor of bankruptcy, did a run begin. And indeed, early banking crises soon appeared. People rushed to withdraw money only to find there wasn't enough real money. Banks failed, windows shuttered, and then governments had to intervene. Governments couldn't let the banking system collapse because banks were the lifeblood of the economy. From that moment, a new financial creature was born: the central bank. Central banks don't serve individual customers, they don't hold your money. They hold the ledgers for other banks. They are the ledger writers for the ledger writers, a higher layer of power where the fate of nations is decided by a few interest rate adjustments and balance sheet manipulations. In this system, commercial banks borrow money from the central bank. They can extend credit, create money from loans, and maintain a stable front that ordinary people are unaware of the underlying risks. But if the system starts to leak like asset bubbles, bad debts, or uncontrolled credit, the entire structure will collapse like dominoes. And then the central bank has to print more money, inject more liquidity, and add a few more lines to the ledger. You could say that from a simple debt recording tool, the ledger has become a tool for coordinating the entire economy. Every line in the books now doesn't just say who owes what to whom, but also directs millions of people to work, invest, save, and consume according to interest rate and credit signals. And it was in that moment that monetary policy became the most powerful weapon. A nation could spend more than it earned by borrowing from the future. And if the central bank backed it, public debt could be financed indefinitely, at least in theory. Deficits were no longer a moral issue, but became a tool of macroeconomic management. But when everyone can spend more than they earn, money begins to lose its real value. The irony is that from money representing value already created, money is now created first, then its value is sought to be justified later. We no longer use gold to back money but government credibility. But where does that credibility come from? From the belief that the government can collect taxes, control inflation, maintain order, and, if necessary, change the rules of the game. The central bank in this system is like a conductor no one elected, but is tacitly entrusted with staging the global monetary symphony. They determine interest rates, decide the money supply, regulate economic cycles with a few lines of changes in the ledger that no one outside of experts truly understands. We, who live beneath that system, only see the consequences: skyrocketing housing prices, depreciating savings, speculative investments inflating like bubbles. But few realize the cause doesn't come from the market, but from subtle adjustments in the central ledger, where no one but a small group has access. When commercial banks became accustomed to lending out more than they held, and central banks became accustomed to printing more money to save the system, a question began to emerge. If every transaction is based on a signal, what happens when the signal is faster than what it represents in the physical world? You can't send a gold bar from America to Europe in seconds. But in the digital world, you can transfer money via online banking with a single click. That click doesn't carry gold, it carries a promise of future payment. You buy something, the system records a transaction in progress. But the actual transfer of money occurs hours, days, or even weeks later, depending on the banking network. The delay between transaction and actual settlement creates an invisible gap, where trust is the only thing keeping the system from collapsing. This is the gray area that the financial world calls clearing. They collect transactions, calculate who owes whom, and then only transfer the final net difference. Very convenient, very efficient, but extremely prone to collapse if just one party in the chain doesn't keep their word. Imagine you are walking on a suspension bridge made of rope. As long as no one bounces too hard, it remains stable. But if someone jumps up, or if several people simultaneously doubt the bridge's strength, it will sway, and everyone will fall. That is systemic risk, a type of risk that doesn't come from an individual, but from the excessively tight interconnectedness of links in the global financial chain. This close connection was once lauded as progress. It helped money move fast at low cost with flexible transactions. But when it's too fast, too cheap, too much, people begin to forget that real money is still a finite commodity and the ledger still needs to be reconciled with reality. In an ideal world, transactions and settlements happen simultaneously. But in reality, transaction speed increasingly outpaces settlement speed. Investors can place thousands of orders per second, constantly cycling capital, using money that never existed to buy real assets. And that entire game operates on the assumption that everyone won't withdraw money at the same time. When trust holds, the system runs like a machine. When trust wavers, it collapses quickly like a domino effect. History is full of examples. In 2008, the world's largest banks found themselves holding countless unpaid assets that no one would settle. The ledger looked beautiful, but the real assets were nowhere to be found. To prevent the system from collapsing, central banks had to intervene, printing trillions of dollars, cleaning the ledger with new money. But that very act caused money to lose its role as a representative of value and become something that represents a perpetual truce. I call that a ledger upon ledgers, when the financial system is no longer based on a simple debt record, but a chain of ledgers piled on top of each other, strung together by layers of promises. And when you're at the very bottom, you no longer know what you're trusting anymore. We live in a world where financial trust is bound by algorithms, by valuation formulas, by credit ratings, but no longer by physical reality. We don't need gold, we don't need physical objects. We just need the system to work. But when everything is just a signal, a single disturbance is enough to break the circuit. The bank is no longer a place that holds money, but a place that recreates reality with data. And there, the ledger no longer records what happened, but predicts what will happen, in the hope that it actually will. We have allowed the ledger to exceed its function, from memory to power, and then to illusion. Part 3. The rise and fall of global monetary orders. No one demands honesty from money during wartime. When cannons roar, there's no room for classroom economic lessons or bank saving advice. In war, every rule can be bent, even monetary rules. Modern history begins with blood and money printed from machines. Napoleon once said, 3 things make for victory: money, money, and money. But he wasn't the first to understand that. For hundreds of years prior, dynasties had discovered the secret to survival. If you want to fight a long war, don't just rely on taxes, print money. The story begins in 18th century Europe. Nations at war, from England and France to the Netherlands, quickly realized their treasuries weren't enough to feed their armies. Gold and vaults didn't multiply, but weapons were increasingly needed. The solution? Issue bonds and then paper money. Initially, paper money was a promise backed by gold. But as the war dragged on, that promise became vague. Governments said, we'll repay the gold when we can. And when we can, was no longer a definite time, paper money began to detach from reality. During the American Revolutionary War, both the revolutionaries and those loyal to Britain printed paper money. The result? Hyperinflation, skyrocketing prices, people began refusing to accept paper money, demanding goods instead. The ledger system based on trust began to collapse because trust was spent like gunpowder. But people didn't stop. When a tool helps you survive the day, you don't easily discard it, even if it poisons the future. By the 20th century, the strange phenomenon was that the more civilized nations, the more wars, the more money was printed. In World War I, European nations simultaneously abandoned the gold standard, a decision disguised as wartime necessity. No longer limited by gold reserves, they could print as much as they wanted, as long as they had paper, ink, and political justification. This not only helped them feed their troops, but also shifted the cost of war to the future by letting citizens bear the burden of inflation. It was during that period that currency became an involuntary bond for the entire population. You didn't need to sign, but by accepting the national currency, you implicitly bore the war debt along with the government. The more flexible the ledger system, the easier it was for the state to manipulate reality. A war was no longer decided on the battlefield, but in the printing room. When World War II broke out, this lesson was fully applied. The US, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union all injected money into the system to finance the war. Behind every soldier was not just weapons, but an entire ledger machine churning relentlessly. And then, after the war, when the blood stopped flowing, the consequences of those inflated ledgers emerged. Inflation, public debt, depreciated currency, restructuring of the monetary system. But no matter how severe the consequences, no one paid the price except the citizens, those who had no power to print money, who were not involved in designing the ledger, but were forced to live within it. What troubled me most was that after every war, we changed to a new monetary system, only to let the very same people who printed money during the war write the new rules of the game. Modern history is not a steady progression. It's a series of explosions, both of weaponry and currency. And each time, one ledger system collapsed to erect another more sophisticated, harder to see, but also easier to manipulate. When World War II concluded, the world entered a strange state. Peace was established, but everything was breaking down. Millions dead, hundreds of cities leveled. The old financial system, based on gold and independent central banks, was completely paralyzed. But amidst that desolation, one power did not collapse. It grew stronger than ever: the United States. America not only won the war, it held most of the world's gold in its vaults. European allies, fearing the Nazis, had transferred their gold to the US for safekeeping. Now, exhausted by war, the US not only held the gold, but also the power to redesign the global ledger. In 1944, at a small hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations met to decide that the world needed a new monetary system, one that could restore trade, rebuild trust, and prevent the world from falling into crisis like the 1930s. The Bretton Woods Agreement was born in that context. In principle, this was a semi-gold standard system. National currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at a rate of 35 USD per ounce of gold. This meant gold was no longer the center, the dollar was. The US became the only country allowed to print money like gold because they committed to holding enough gold reserves to back every dollar issued. At first glance, this was a brilliant solution: a stable, easily controlled system with a central coordinator, yet still retaining the facade of a link to gold. But deep within, a mechanism of asymmetrical benefits was forming. Other nations had to accumulate dollars for international transactions. To get dollars, they had to export goods, do business with the US, or borrow from global financial institutions controlled by the US. Meanwhile, the US could print dollars to consume, invest, and build a global empire without having to pay immediately with real goods. That was the exorbitant privilege of monetary dominance, what scholars call exorbitant privilege. With its role as the issuer of the global reserve currency, the US could spend beyond its internal capacity because others were always willing to hold dollars as a form of paper gold. For the first 2 decades after the war, this system worked quite well. The world rebuilt, trade surged, capital flows increased, and growth was high. But then, like every ledger system that had been abused, cracks appeared. The US began to overspend on the Vietnam War, on the Great Society social programs, on colossal plans without balancing the budget. Dollars were printed profusely, but gold reserves did not increase. Other nations began to grow suspicious. France under de Gaulle was the one who dared to say loudly what everyone else whispered: "We don't want to hold dollars anymore, give us gold." They sent ships to New York to exchange dollars for gold in accordance with the Bretton Woods commitment. The U.S. quietly handed over the gold, but concerns spread. Other countries also wanted to withdraw. If everyone demanded gold, the U.S. would run out. And then the fateful day arrived, August 1971. President Richard Nixon announced the closure of the gold window. This meant that from then on, the U.S. no longer allowed dollars to be exchanged for gold. The Bretton Woods Commitment, which was the foundation of global trust, was abolished by a single televised declaration. No conference, no referendum, no vote. The global ledger was changed by one man. From that moment, money was no longer linked to anything physical. No gold, no silver, just signals, paper, trust, and the political and military power of the issuing nation. The world shifted to a new order, the fiat currency system, where money exists simply because someone decrees that it has value. After the curtain fell on the gold standard in 1971, the world entered a gray area. Money was no longer tied to any material value, yet it was still used as if it were. People called it trust. I saw it as a global-scale deception, maintained by the logic of power rather than market logic. The problem was, if the dollar was no longer convertible to gold, why did other countries still need dollars? The answer lay in oil. In the 1970s, after the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the U.S. had to find a new way to redefine the dollar's value, no longer by gold, but by something even more critical in the industrial age: energy. And so, the U.S. quietly signed a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia, the country controlling the largest oil supply at the time. The agreement was incredibly simple but had immense historical weight. The U.S. committed to protecting Saudi Arabia's security, and in return, Saudi Arabia would only sell oil in dollars. This forced the entire world, whether they liked the U.S. or not, to accumulate dollars to buy energy. To develop, you needed electricity. To have electricity, you needed oil. And oil could only be paid for in dollars. The world was no longer bound by the gold vault in New York, but by daily energy needs. A new financial order was born, the petrodollar system. It was devastatingly simple. Every nation had to earn dollars through exporting goods, borrowing, or foreign investment. The U.S., as the issuer of dollars, didn't need to export equivalent goods, but could still import resources, technology, and labor from everywhere simply by printing money. Many thought this was a period of stability, but no, this was a balance based on imbalance. One side spent freely, the other had to accumulate. And like every lopsided structure, it created accumulating resentment. In the 1980s, the U.S. gained another soft power: the highly developed financial markets. When you have the global reserve currency, you can determine world interest rates, attract capital flows, and shape the prices of all types of assets, from bonds and stocks to real estate in other countries. Developing nations, lacking dollars, had to borrow. They borrowed in dollars with interest calculated according to U.S. rates, but their income was in weaker local currencies. If the U.S. raised interest rates even slightly, capital would drain from poorer countries, causing widespread currency crises. Asia in 1997, Argentina in 2001, Russia in 1998. The list goes on, and each time there was a crisis, the IMF, a Western-controlled organization, came to the rescue by lending with conditions for reform. But who controlled the IMF? Who decided the conditions for reform? The answer didn't need to be written, just look at which nations had veto power on the board. You see, the global ledger was no longer just a balance sheet. It was a geopolitical structure disguised as economics. I call it the financial gatekeeper. Whoever holds the gate holds everything. And since 1971, the U.S. held the key. But like all empires, the petrodollar order also had its cycles. When the U.S. printed money out of control, as after the 2008 crisis and then the 2020 pandemic, trust began to waver. Countries like China, Russia, and Iran began to push for bilateral trade in local currencies. Gold reserves increased, and the SWIFT system came under suspicion. Alternatives were discussed. Nothing has changed in form yet, but in essence, the old order has begun to disintegrate from within. When everyone understands that the dollar is merely a political convention and no longer a store of value, the pivot will come. And like 1971, it won't be announced, not voted on, no conferences. Just one day, someone will withdraw from the game, and the game ends. Part 4. The entropy of the fiat ledger. Money once represented gold, then it represented oil. Now money represents only itself. If you've ever watched a fire dancer in a circus, you'll understand. As long as the hands don't shake and the fire doesn't fall, the audience applauds. But when the fire falls, no one cares about the technique anymore, they just want to leave the show. The modern financial system is dancing with fire. We call it the fiat system, meaning money is created without relying on anything tangible. It is no longer the crystallization of labor, nor does it represent national resources. It is simply a stream of signals issued by the central bank, and the entire economy operates on the tacit acceptance that those signals mean something. The problem is, the more signals, the less meaning. The current fiat system operates with three main gears: the central bank, commercial banks, and financial markets. Every time you deposit money into an account, the bank doesn't keep that exact amount. They use it as a basis to lend, creating new money through credit. Every loan recorded in the ledger is a new line, a promise of future payment. Thus, money is born not from production but from expectation. Think about this: a house yet to be built, a business not yet operational, a person not yet employed, all can become reasons for a bank to create money, as long as the credit profile looks reasonable. You are living in a world where most money never existed before someone borrowed it. That's not wrong if all promises are kept. But when the market loses confidence or falls into crisis, all those promises evaporate, and all the money created from expectations suddenly disappears like smoke. We call that a recession. The cruel irony is that to prevent recession, central banks have to create new expectations. They cut interest rates, buy assets, inject money into the system with terms like quantitative easing, fiscal stimulus, stabilizing liquidity. But strip away that technocratic language, and you'll see they are printing money to buy time. The printed money doesn't flow into the real economy. It pours into financial markets, into real estate, stocks, speculative assets, creating values that were never built with sweat. It creates billionaires from lines of signals, creating a society where wealth and poverty are no longer determined by productivity, but by your position in the chain of receiving newly printed money. This phenomenon is called the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon, an 18th-century economist, pointed out that when new money is injected into the system, the first recipients benefit the most because they buy goods at old prices before prices rise. Later recipients, like workers, retirees, and small business owners, have to buy goods at new prices while their incomes haven't changed. The result: printing money to help the poor ultimately makes them poorer. We live in a society where the market is no longer a place for efficient resource allocation, but a place that absorbs the side effects of monetary policy. Housing prices rise not because of a housing shortage, but because of an excess of money. Stock prices rise not because businesses are doing well, but because central banks dare not let them fall. Gold, Bitcoin, NFTs all become havens, not because they are inherently good, but because fiat is so bad. I once asked a young person why they bought a house at a price 30 times their income. They said, "If I don't buy now, it'll be even higher tomorrow." That's no longer market logic, it's the logic of desperation. When money depreciates faster than the fear of debt, we have created an economy where every currency unit carries the promise of the next crisis. Finance used to be an industry that served the real economy. It was like a circulatory system, channeling capital where needed, pumping blood into production machines, to people with ideas to create goods, services, and jobs. But then, in the modern fiat system, finance is no longer the bloodstream. It has become the central nervous system controlling the entire body, even when the brain is no longer communicating with the limbs. We call this process financialization. Everything from housing, healthcare, education, and art to social media is packaged as assets, valued by discounted cash flow models, listed, bought, sold, and speculated upon. A house is no longer a home, it's a sanctuary asset. A painting is no longer an emotion, it's an alternative investment commodity. A university is no longer a place of learning, it's a tool for generating returns through tuition. When money is cheap, people don't invest in things of value, but in things that can make others think they have value. Every decision becomes a game of expectation. A listed company doesn't need to be profitable, it just needs user growth. A startup doesn't need positive cash flow, it just needs a good enough story to raise the next round. And workers in that world no longer work to live, but live to pay off debt. I once read a financial report from a bread-making company. They made less profit than the previous year, but their stock price still rose. Why? Because they announced they would buy back shares, meaning they weren't using money to upgrade factories or increase workers' wages, but using cheap borrowed money to inflate asset prices. You see, we're not making better bread, we're just making it seem more expensive. Financialization doesn't just turn everything into a commodity, it also turns everyone into an asset holder. And in that world, anyone without assets will forever be an outsider. If you're born into a family with no house, no stocks, no land, you start life in the negative. Because fiat money depreciates daily, but assets increase hourly. And every time the central bank provides liquidity, you move further away from being able to buy a home. We call that inequality, but the deeper essence is a distortion of the ledger. Today's ledger no longer records effort but position. Those who come first benefit, those who come later chase already inflated bubbles. You can't blame young people for pouring money into crypto, NFTs, meme stocks. It's a survival reaction when they see themselves excluded from the traditional game. When working hard no longer helps you keep pace with house prices rising every quarter, you'll look for something that can rise in a few days. And that's when systemic risk becomes immeasurable, because people no longer make decisions based on intrinsic value, but on the expected speed of price appreciation by others. Such a system is like a dance floor built on beautiful, glamorous ice, but one slip is enough to bring the whole floor down. I once believed that the central bank was the most stable institution in society. Now, I understand that it is the place that holds hands with the market to create an illusion of stability by continuously distorting reality. They cannot let the bubble burst because when it bursts, everyone will look at the foundation and see nothing but promises. No one remembers the last time the government balanced its budget. In the modern fiat world, deficit spending is the norm, not the exception. The question is no longer whether we should borrow, but how much we should borrow to keep the wheels turning. Public debt has become the default source of growth. Every recession, every market shock, the Treasury opens, the central bank cuts interest rates, buys bonds, and adds new lines to the ledger. We owe ourselves. This isn't theoretical. Look at the balance sheets of major central banks, from the Fed and ECB to the BOJ. The numbers are increasing exponentially, not because they want to, but because they have no way back. In a system where economic growth depends on borrowing from the future, any sign of slowdown can trigger a chain reaction. Asset prices collapse, unemployment rises, businesses fail, banks default. And to prevent that, the system is forced to keep injecting money, even though it knows that the more it injects, the weaker the roots become. We call that a liquidity trap, but in essence, it's a trust trap. The belief that the system will survive. If enough people believe it, it will exist a self-reinforcing circle, like a pyramid scheme, but on a global scale. The problem is not just the amount of money being borrowed, but the deteriorating quality of the debt over time. Debt is no longer created to invest in production. It is used to buy back shares, fund subsidies, feed an inflated administrative apparatus, and even pay off old debts. A nation borrowing money to spend on things that do not generate cash flow means it is digging a deeper hole without building an escape bridge. I am not against debt, but I am against treating debt as permanent. Because when no one thinks about paying it back, debt is no longer a tool. It is a physical tether binding you to the wheel of history. And then there's this, the debt cycle. Ray Dalio once described the economy as operating in short and long debt cycles. Short cycles, typically 5-8 years, are the familiar boom and bust phases. But long debt cycles, roughly 50-75 years, are when the entire system must restructure because debt can no longer be paid with real money, but can only be erased by inflation, default, or war. We are at the tail end of that long cycle. Real interest rates are near zero. There are no more stimulus tools. Public debt exceeds the stability threshold. There is no more room for spending, growth slows, there is no more political justification for printing money, and people's trust in fiat currency already fragile begins to erode with the rate of price increases. This is where the entropy of the ledger peaks, when every line of numbers no longer represents anything concrete. A dollar, A yen they are no longer mirrors reflecting labor, resources, or creativity. They are enchanted quantities, existing only because they are repeated in the media, financial reports, and the belief that everything will be fine. But in the physical sense, entropy is the tendency of all systems to move toward chaos if left uncontrolled. The ledger is heading toward that state. The more you try to control it, the more you have to bend reality. The more you adjust the numbers, the further you get from the truth. The more you pump money, the more you destroy the price structure. And at some point, the collapse is no longer if, but when it arrives. Don't ask why no one warned you, because the warning is here, in the very ledger you read every day. You just need to read it with eyes no longer enchanted by numbers. Part 5. Internet Native Money. Every crisis sows the seeds of a rebellion. In 2008, when the global financial system reeled, when banks failed, people lost homes, and those who caused the crisis were rescued with trillions of newly printed dollars, an anonymous person or group uploaded a 9-page document to the internet. It had a simple, almost humble title: Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But inside it was a declaration of war against the entire existing monetary order. The author, Satoshi Nakamoto, no one knows who he is, where he is, or even if it's one person or many. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that he created a ledger system that doesn't need a central bank, no government, no intermediary organization. It lives on the internet, verified by thousands of independent computers. No one can delete, edit, or counterfeit it. Every transaction is publicly recorded, immutable, and anyone can verify it. This is not just technology, it's a new paradigm for trust. Bitcoin doesn't promise profit, it promises fairness in rules. No one can arbitrarily create more Bitcoin. The maximum supply is capped at 21 million units. There is no one at the top for you to beg favors from. No one can print more Bitcoin the way governments did with paper money. Bitcoin is the first currency that carries no one's special privilege. But make no mistake, Bitcoin wasn't born from faith in technology. It was born from desperate disappointment with the old system. The world after 2008 was no longer the world of Adam Smith and self-regulating markets. It was the world of too big to fail, of central banks playing God, saving with negative interest rates and unlimited money printing. A world where those who created the risk were not the ones who bore the consequences. In that world, Bitcoin was like a shout, "We don't trust you anymore." And strangely enough, that shout was written in code. Blockchain, the technology platform behind Bitcoin, is a form of distributed ledger. Instead of being stored in a central location, it is synchronously copied across thousands of network nodes. Each new transaction must be agreed upon and confirmed by the entire network through a mechanism called proof of work. It sounds complicated, but you can understand it simply. To be recorded in the ledger, each line must be paid for with consumed electricity, that is, real effort. Unlike fiat, where someone can type a few keys and money appears, here, the act of recording must be an act of labor, and that's what makes Bitcoin different. The ledger is tied to physical reality, something fiat lost long ago. People often say Bitcoin uses too much energy, but that's not a flaw, it's a feature. In a world where anyone can print money, a system that deliberately makes money creation expensive is a statement: we will not let anyone manipulate the ledger. I remember the first day I tried to send a Bitcoin transaction. No bank, no SMS confirmation, no KYC needed. No one asked who I was, there was just a string of characters, a few minutes of waiting, and then it was confirmed immutable, permanent, global. It was a feeling of unprecedented freedom, not just with money, but with self-determination. Bitcoin is not a dream of getting rich. It is a dream of holding the pen to write in your own ledger without asking anyone for permission. Initially, Bitcoin was a game for eccentrics. They didn't trust governments, disliked banks, and were willing to accept the inconvenience of storing private keys, waiting 10 minutes for transaction confirmation, and enduring extreme price volatility just to say one thing: I don't need you to live. But then the world changed. When developed nations printed trillions of dollars to rescue markets, when inflation returned like a forgotten ghost, when digital banking systems collapsed in just a few days, like Silicon Valley Bank in 2023, even those who once scoffed at Bitcoin began to ask, how can an asset with no CEO, no headquarters, no advertising, survive for 15 years, despite all media attacks, legal bans, and technological changes? How can a stateless currency, guaranteed by no one, trade 24/7 globally without ever being hacked at its base layer? The answer lies in the fact that Bitcoin is not a company, it is a protocol. You can ban a bank, you can bankrupt a business. But how do you ban a decentralized mathematical protocol? Just as no one owns email, no one controls TCP/IP, Bitcoin is also an open protocol where anyone can participate, anyone can run a node, anyone can verify transactions. That provides something fiat cannot have: independent verification. In the traditional system, you trust the bank. The bank trusts the central bank. The central bank trusts the government trusts itself, and when any link breaks, the entire trust collapses. With Bitcoin, you don't need to trust anyone. You just run the software and you have a copy of the ledger just like everyone else. No blind faith, only verification. But that absolute transparency also comes with a problem: congestion and difficulty in scaling. Each block in the chain has a limited capacity, processing speed is slow, transaction fees increase when the network is overloaded, and because every node must store the entire transaction history, the system has clear physical limits, something centralized systems don't face. What's the answer? For Bitcoin, it's conservatism. They choose to protect security and decentralization rather than expand too quickly. But for other communities, like Ethereum, it's experimentation. Ethereum was born with a different goal. Not just money, but a platform for all decentralized applications. Instead of just recording transactions, Ethereum can run code snippets called smart contracts, meaning no lawyers, no notaries, no third parties needed. Just code that is written and automatically executed. That opens up a new world: decentralized finance, DeFi, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, blockchain games, automated insurance, and countless other applications. An internet where value, not just information, is transmitted instantly. But what is the cost? It's complexity. Ethereum is not as simple as Bitcoin, it needs continuous upgrades. It has weaknesses in its code, it has been attacked, it even split its chain due to a hack. And to scale, Ethereum moved to a new mechanism: proof of stake instead of proof of work. That saves energy, but also raises the question: if those with more money have more power to confirm transactions, how is that different from the old system? The crypto world has diverged from here. On one side, Bitcoin is a conservative fortress protecting security, absolute neutrality. On the other side, Ethereum and thousands of other coins are a playground for innovation, flexible, fast-growing, but also easily abused. Many tokens have no real value and exist only for quick riches. Many projects are just disguised Ponzi schemes, attaching the blockchain label to raise funds and then disappear. And each time that happens, trust in the entire ecosystem wavers. But deep beneath that speculative froth, a persistent current still flows. The desire for a new ledger system where no one can print more money, no one can block your transactions, and everyone plays by the same rules. The biggest question that Bitcoin's opponents often raise is that it consumes too much energy. So, is it worth it? This question sounds moral, but if you look closely, you'll see it's misguided. Because the problem is not how much energy Bitcoin consumes, but what it is replacing. The global banking system, with millions of servers, hundreds of thousands of branches, teams of auditors, lawyers, risk managers, huge data centers, and complex operational activities, also consumes energy. And even more than that, it consumes trust, fairness, and personal freedom. Bitcoin, by simplifying everything down to a single mathematical rule solve, a difficult problem to record in the ledger, has replaced the entire power structure with a consensus mechanism. That means the energy consumed is the price of eliminating intermediaries, so no one can print more money, no one can block your transactions for political reasons, no one can silently adjust the ledger to serve a minority. Is it worth it? The answer depends on how much value you place on true ownership of your money. But not everyone wants to hand power back to individuals. Governments, after a period of indifference to crypto, began to realize this wasn't a game, it was a threat. And so, they launched a countermeasure: central bank digital currency, CBDC. At first glance, it sounds like crypto, but in reality, it's a more extreme centralized version than even current fiat. With CBDC, every citizen will have an account directly at the central bank. No commercial banks as intermediaries sounds convenient. But it also means the government can track, limit, or revoke your money in real time. You say the wrong thing, your money is frozen. You save too much, your money expires. You spend on the wrong target, your transaction is denied. If fiat is conditional trust, then CBDC is controlled obedience. On the other hand, the cryptocurrency community continues to innovate. The Lightning Network was born on Bitcoin, allowing instant transactions with nearly zero fees. It doesn't change Bitcoin's fundamental principles, but improves speed and scalability. Stablecoins also flourished, especially those like USDC and USDT, which allow holding stable value while still trading like crypto. They have become a bridge between the fiat and blockchain worlds, though risks always loom. Ethereum is moving towards Layer 2 solutions like Optimism and Arbitrum to scale without sacrificing security. We are living in a chaotic period where every idea about money is being tested in parallel, and every choice you make using a bank, holding stablecoins, storing Bitcoin, experimenting with DeFi is a philosophical choice. Who do you trust? The government, the central bank, venture capitalists, anonymous developers, or yourself? Internet-native money doesn't promise a paradise. It also has flaws, risks, scams galore, vague regulations. But it offers something unprecedented: the ability to control your assets without asking permission. And perhaps, in a world where everything can be monitored, frozen, or manipulated, that ability in itself is a form of freedom worth defending. Part 6: Technology and Human Rights. You once thought money was just a means to buy food, pay bills, go to work, save for retirement. But no, money is the operating system of society, and like every operating system, it can be designed to serve you or to control you. In the 21st century, when everything becomes data, when every transaction leaves a trace, privacy is no longer a personal matter, but the line between freedom and modern slavery. A person who has no control over their money is a person who has no rights at all. We used to think only dictators froze bank accounts, only terrorists had transactions blocked. But then one day, a single mother was denied tuition payment because she lived in a sanctioned region. A journalist had their account frozen for investigating corruption. A protest supporter was labeled a financial extremist. The question is no longer whether power has been abused, but to what extent it has already been abused. Digital money sounds convenient, but it also means every dollar you spend is a trace, and every trace is a piece of data that can be analyzed, connected, exploited. And when data becomes a tool to shape behavior, you are no longer a consumer but a chain of probabilities in someone's predictive model. That's why money is directly related to human rights. Without the right to use money, you have no right to travel, eat, get medical care, be educated, or express dissent. The current fiat system doesn't say that outright. It disguises it through banking laws, anti-money laundering regulations, and financial system protection. But if you look deep enough, you'll see that the ledger itself is being redesigned to serve power instead of people. Canada in 2022, those who donated to a protest convoy against vaccine mandates had their accounts frozen without court order. Nigeria, young people using Bitcoin to support the End SARS movement against police brutality had their bank transactions blocked. In China, your health, green code, app can change color if you go to the wrong place, and your account is immediately frozen. That's not the future, that's the present happening now. I don't write this to cause alarm. I write because I believe we can do better. The internet was once a free land, but then it was commercialized, dominated by giant platforms, monitored with every click. But it was also from there that decentralized networks emerged, encrypted social media, secure email, trace-free messaging. We have reclaimed some privacy, so why not do that with money? Decentralized, private, encrypted money is not for tax evasion, money laundering, or causing trouble, but to preserve personal space in an increasingly surveilled world. You can live your whole life without carrying a gun, but if you can't carry your own wallet, are you truly living? In classical warfare, the strong win. Larger numbers, superior weapons, advantageous terrain. You overwhelm, you occupy, you win. But in the digital world, especially the battle for control over money, a new rule emerges: asymmetric defense. What does that mean? It means that an individual, if they know how to use the right tools, can protect their financial freedom more effectively than any bank, corporation, or government can control them. When a system relies on a center to operate, like fiat, like CBDC, then by controlling the center, you control everything. But if the system is distributed, encrypted, and decentralized, control becomes almost impossible. Bitcoin is the first example, but after it, there's an entire ecosystem of financial defense technologies. Non-custodial wallets, hardware wallets, multi-sig signatures, privacy coins, like Monero, GRIN, satellite data transmission protocols, Blockstream Satellite, anti-censorship P2P networks I2P, Tor. All are defensive tools, not offensive, but sufficient to present technical barriers to any repressive policy before it encounters moral barriers. Imagine an activist living in a totalitarian country. Their bank account frozen, phone monitored, but still able to receive international funding in Bitcoin, sent via the Lightning Network, stored on a paper wallet or encrypted QR code. No one can block it, no one can seize it, no one can arbitrarily value it based on morality. That is asymmetric defense, and it empowers those who have no power. Of course, like any tool, it can be abused. But the solution is not prohibition, but building a culture of technology coupled with ethical awareness. We cannot block messages just because some send spam, just as we cannot stifle the right to property simply because some evade taxes. Society should not be designed to fight evil by tying the hands of good people. In the fiat world, you have to trust the law, the bank, the government. In the world of open finance, you only need to trust the source code and the community of people also striving for transparency. That's not a romantic illusion. It's a survival strategy for marginalized communities. And you don't need to wait until you are oppressed to see its necessity. You have the right not to be tracked every time you make a payment. You have the right to hold your money without fear of someone pressing a freeze button. You have the right to send money to your mother, friends, or an NGO without explaining yourself to any censor. We once took freedom of speech for granted as the foundation of a democratic society. But in the new world, financial freedom is the right that must be reclaimed. Because all other rights become meaningless if you cannot use money to act. And like all rights, it is not granted. It is protected by the community, by technology, and by those who dare to say, I will not let anyone write in the ledger for me anymore. The world won't change because of a speech, nor because of a line of code. The world only changes when people begin to re-ask questions that seem to have answers. What is money? Not the papers in your wallet, not the numbers in your bank account, not the chip embedded in your credit card. Money is a temporarily agreed-upon reference system of value by society, and like everything agreed upon, it can be rewritten. The problem is, who has the right to rewrite it? For centuries, the answer was the powerful. States, banks, governments, global financial alliances. But with the advent of internet-native money Bitcoin, Ethereum, open-source protocols for the first time, everyone has the opportunity to participate in redefining money. Not everyone has to accept it, no one is forced to use it, but if you want to, you can choose a different path. A path where money isn't printed without warning. A path where transactions aren't canceled for political reasons. A path where the ledger is a distributed network, no center, no privilege. A path where money is not just a medium but an ethical declaration. I exist, I have value, and I will not let anyone else define that for me. That's not a dream, it's an invitation. You don't need to be an engineer, a blockchain expert, or understand every white paper. You just need the courage to ask questions again and enough patience to find the answers. The current system, broken, won't collapse overnight. It erodes gradually through every bailout package, every interest rate manipulation, every press of the print button for money for which no one takes responsibility. But you, with an electronic wallet, a seed phrase, a transparent choice, are already the seed of a new system. No one can promise it's a perfect system. It will have flaws, scams, losses. But it has something the old system lost long ago: the ability to verify, the ability to challenge, the ability to improve without asking permission. And if you believe that humans deserve more than a system maintained by fear and the illusion of stability, then you are already part of a revolution. No protests needed, no weapons needed, just a small decision to choose your own ledger. And perhaps one day, looking back, we will see that amidst crises, amidst collapses, amidst repression and disappointment, there were still people quietly writing a different line into history. We did not accept corrupted money.